Coming the history of autism, part 2. As doctors and family doctors and pediatricians are starting to know more about autism, they still didn't understand it. In the 60s, they thought it was schizophrenia or multiple personality disorder. A lot thought it was some mental illness or some sort of disease, but that was in the 60s, and a lot of kids in the 60s got institutionalized. But in the 30s, Dr. Asperger's found out about it. He didn't understand what it was, and he did experiments. It was not good. Then eventually he started to tell a certain someone that we need to be cast, and people with autism with other diverse abilities were linked under the Holocaust. And then in the 40s, Canada and a bunch of other countries would do lobotomies on people with autism, saying, oh, they will do better. But it actually wasn't, because cutting a frontal lobe of your brain was not a good idea. It made it worse, and it caused us not to know how to make a decision, because we lost that part of the brain. And yeah, that happened throughout the 30s, 40s, 50s, all the way up until the 60s, and then that got outlawed. But in the 60s, we still are being institutionalized. And in the 70s, Canada would force us, in the 60s and 70s, would force us into a school away from families. And they just would say people with autism were idiots. Not true, but that's what they labeled us as in the 60s and 70s. In the 80s, the school thing got closed down. A lot of those kind of schools where they would force you away from your family. In 1979 was the Inclusive Education Act. And then in 80s, we're being institutionalized after we were done school. And then in 1986, they were ordered to shut down the institutions for the autistic spectrum. And then in the 80s was the first film of autism, the Rain Man, but it's very dated now. And it was a step in the right direction at the time, because there was no really movies showing it really before. It was just like documentary things, or government would film autistic people and then they would hide it in an archive. But eventually people found those archives. But yeah, the government used to archive those films, and that was like the first like public film, and that was a step in the right direction. But yeah, but the spectrum is a huge spectrum. I'll be doing part 3 of the history of autism, where we get more out of the dark ages. The 80s was new beginning, and they were starting to get out of the dark ages for autism. And I'll do about the 90s, about the work conditions for people on the spectrum that weren't great, but they diagnosed people more, and education-wise, schools were better in the 90s than they ever were before the 90s. But that's the end of this blog for the history of autism, part 2. Stay tuned for part 3 next week. And you are loved.